So, just a few points before we go. Some of the issues I think we need to talk. First of all, Michel Barnier is not going to run. I'm not sure who in Brussels floated that idea. It's stupid. Welcome back to the latest episode of Uncommon Decency, your weekly podcast on the big European debates of our time. And this week, I'm hijacking the show and making it all about La France and its chaotic political landscape. How can anyone govern a nation that has 246 different kinds of cheese? Charles de Gaulle once said. But there isn't just the smell of camembert in the French air these days. There's also a distinct smell of electoral gunpowder. So, it's time we do a special wargaming episode on the 2022 French presidential election. And I'm sure we are going to forget 15 different issues we could be covering. And the candidate that just might win in 2022, we might not even mention on this show. But we are staking our necks out, which is risky in France, to map out what the election might just look like. So, if you are listening to us in 2023, and somehow Michel Barnier is the president, please don't be too harsh. Before we begin, if you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast app, rating us and writing a review. It always puts a smile on our faces to see your feedback and pushes us to keep getting la crème de la crème of guests.
So, Francois, let's get right into the heart of it. How's the race looking in your judgment? What are some of the things to be aware of in terms of just the state of play and the major parties that are going to be in the running in May 2022? What should our audience just be aware of going into this?
Well, it's a very empty landscape, I feel. It's both very empty and very compact at the same time. It's very empty because traditionally, in these presidential elections, you'd have people who had been lining up for that election for years, two main parties, smaller parties around. It'd be very clear who'd be running and who wouldn't be. Nowadays, it's much more complicated because we know for a fact that Le Pen will be running. She said so. There's little doubt Macron will be running. But the rest of it is really open, and it's not very clear that the right-wing party will even field a candidate. It might have to support someone that is not part of the party. On the left, it's not clear whether there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates. So there's a big void, and at the same time, there's a lot of candidates at the same time, but it's not very clear which will rise on top. Now, what is pretty clear at this point is it's a two-person race between Le Pen and Macron as of now in polls. The rest of them are pretty far behind, and that is fair to some extent because they have dominated French politics over the past 5 years. If people have been following, remember the European elections in 2019 were won by Le Pen, and Macron came in second position, very far away from the rest of the opposition. So yeah, but it is the state of France. It is Macron, Le Pen, and the rest.
So let me jump right in and just ask you. Short while ago, I was speaking to one of the dear friends of the show, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, who reports on French life, kind of for the Anglo-American media, and she wasn't all that convinced that 2022 was going to be a reenactment of 2017. Right? She just didn't see it as kind of a foregone conclusion. She was hedging for I guess the possibility of someone like Xavier Bertrand, who I was hoping you could give us some background on who this new center right personality is. But what are just kind of begin from the start? What is the you just mentioned? Why would the center right, kind of the present iteration of the Gaullist sensibility, right? This party has gone through all of these different kind of configurations from like RPR, MPR, UMP, Les Républicains. Why would this political family of sort of like center-right, souverainist, Gaullist, why would the French center-right not decide to not field a candidate in the first round, and why would they endorse Macron?
Well, I think since in 2017, the centre-right party, Les Républicains, was convinced they would win. The socialist president was so weak, François Hollande, he didn't even decide to run again. And they were convinced they would easily reach for runoff against Le Pen and crush Le Pen pretty easily. Now, their candidate François Fillon was chosen in a primary, in a tense primary, and his candidacy essentially got imploded over corruption scandals and um, a lot of kind of personal life scandals really crippled his candidacy and allowed Macron to fight against Le Pen in the runoff and win. And ever since, it has been limping. Um, it fielded what I thought was an interesting candidate, François-Xavier Bellamy, who's an intellectual, he's a philosopher, whatnot. But François-Xavier Bellamy couldn't resist the kind of forces on his right and on his left dividing the party. You've got a lot of former MPs, a lot of the electorate is going to Macron, and to some extent, there's also that same forces pushing electorate and MPs towards Le Pen. And in the middle, it is kind of between a rock and a hard place, so to speak.
But he was a European. He led a European ticket, right? Was he ever in that sort of like wide field of like? Just to pick you up on where you left off, there is a lot to be learned from how the center right kind of went about their 2017 race going into 2022. There's a lot there that we can work with and try to glean kind of what's going to be ahead of us. And in that race, when if we rewind back to 2017, that was indeed a very hopeful and optimistic race for the right in the initial stages. Right, we had like this sort of like open field with a lot of the barons de la droite, right, a lot of the kind of center right quadra, as they're called in this country, kind of pitching their personalities, right, and what it narrowed down to was a sort of an internecine sort of like race between Fillon, Juppé, and Sarko, right? And I think it was really, I think what you just explained there was really important because the center right really took it. It really was already like running in the runoff, right? It was already like campaigning to the wider electorate. And then Fillon got drafted as a sort of the Thatcherite, sort of hardcore reformist candidate. And then he stumbled over Penelope Gate, right? And um, uh, you know, so let me ask you this: Is the center right? What is the center? What did the center right learn from 2017? And if you could maybe give us some background of kind of what are the names that are they're shaping up to run in 2022? You mentioned that. What would some of the others be? And are any of these people like? Have any of these candidates learned anything from 2017?
So it actually depends who you ask. Those who liked Fillon will say there's nothing to change, or there's some things to change, but not much to change. He was sunk by the personal scandals. Those who disagreed with Fillon's line said scandals aren't everything. The uber Thatcherite agenda scared a lot of people as well. And so, depending how economically liberal or statist you are, you'll have a very different answer. I'm not sure there's an easy fix. It's very hard when you're being crushed on your right and on your left to have a solution. Now, there are some candidates in the running. One of them is the most, I think, probably the strongest on paper, Xavier Bertrand. Xavier Bertrand is this right-wing politician who is in charge of the northern Hauts-de-France region. He's been doing quite well there. He's quite popular in the north. And thing is, I can't really distinguish him politically from Macron, but he's been doing a very good job at identifying himself as being this local politician who understands France and its social issues a lot better than Macron, who is this Parisian, who's disconnected from the local political realities, who's arrogant, who represents technocracy and whatnot. Now, some of it may be true because Macron had no local experience, no traditional political career, and Bertrand does. That said, I can't really distinguish him politically beyond that kind of difference, which part of it seems like a bit of a savvy marketing from Bertrand. Another one is Valérie Pécresse. She is the head of the Ile-de-France region, the region that includes Paris. And I think she's a weaker version of Bertrand. Similar profile, same age. She's in charge of a kind of a richer region. He's in charge of more of a post-industrial region. but I don't see that much different. And then you have kind of what's interesting about both of them is they both left Les Républicains. They both left the party because they disagreed with a leader back then, Laurent Wauquiez, who's now left the party. He's no longer in charge. They both left and disagreed, because they didn't think belonging to this party was a source of strength anymore. They thought they could be stronger on their own, which says a lot about how divided and how weak the right is. But that said, if you look at polls, Pécresse isn't doing that well in polls, but if you look at polls, Xavier Bertrand is at 16%, which is pretty good. Which is pretty good for someone who's running on his name only, and in fact he's a decent head of a region. 16%. He's a few points behind Macron and Le Pen, but who knows? He wins a few, Macron loses a few, or could be in a good position.
So he's polling at 16% in the open field. He's polling 16% against Macron's 53 to 59%, and MLP's Le Pen's 47. Right. So that's kind of how the races. That's kind of how the polls are.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, the 53% and 47% are in the runoff. In the first round, it depends on which pollster and which scenarios and which candidate. But Macron and Le Pen would be in the mid 20s, and Bertrand is in 16%. It's a pretty wide gap, but we've seen wild, crazier comebacks than that. So I agree with what Moutet says. I think historically, when you're a student of French presidential election histories, you see a pattern. First of all, there's a few patterns. First of all, the scenario which is dominant in polls a year to a year and a half before the actual election never gets respected by the electorate. The electorate look at it in scoff and just get rid of it completely every single time. Nobody would have thought Macron would be running, yet alone winning, a year and a half before the election, and yet he did. In 2012, people thought that it would be Dominique Strauss-Kahn who would become president, when in fact he wasn't even in a position to run. In 2007, nobody thought Ségolène Royal would be able to be the socialist candidate. 2002, nobody saw Jean-Marie Le Pen reaching the runoff against Chirac, and the list goes on and on and on. So every single time, the kind of established scenario just gets thrown out of window by the electorate. And secondly, what is interesting is the government in office always loses the presidential election, and this has been the case since the 80s. Now, there's a weird kind of quirk about French politics, which is back in the 80s and 90s, you could technically have a socialist president with a right-wing government, or vice versa, which makes that a bit more complicated. But essentially, the government in office always loses the next presidential election whatsoever. So these things are kind of a word of caution on the established scenario, which is Macron would meet Le Pen in a runoff and win, maybe in the tighter scenario in 2017, but win nonetheless. I think these kind of historical elements are a word of caution.
Yeah, and I guess your point about the historical record of government, or at least government seconded presidential tickets, have a record of losing in the court of public opinion, and I guess part of it boils down to the constitutional sort of like reshuffling that happened when the 7-year mandate was shortened down to a 5-year mandate, right, from le septennat to le quinquennat. When did that happen again? Early 2000s?
So it's since 2002, the presidential mandate has been of 5 years. Before that, it was of 7 years. For example, François Mitterrand got 2 7-year mandates, so he ruled for a total of 14 years.
And that, right, and the reason why that sort of sets the government party up for really tough kind of dress down in the electorate whenever the president of the republic runs for re-election. The reason for that is because I guess the cohabitation, the possibility of two different parties kind of controlling the prime ministership and the presidency, right? The possibility of, for instance, having a center-right president and a socialist prime minister has happened in the Chirac-Jospin cohabitation. That kind of gives the president cover, right? It allows it to when it runs to say, all of these wonderful, beautiful things that I would have done, I wasn't able to do because my prime minister wasn't seconding me in parliament. And but I do want to go back to something. So right. So and just to kind of finish off on the whole center right field, I do think it is super important what you've just outlined. We have this. As you said, two candidates, not all that different on paper. I do think something we should perhaps highlight is that Xavier Bertrand differs from Pécresse, sort of like énarque quadrat profile, right? Pécresse, Paris regional president, right? She's really kind of within the mold of the technocratic um, leadership profile, right? She's been leading this region rather successfully. I think a lot of the credit she gets from successfully bringing some of the post-Brexit investments from the UK is certainly going to help her, or at least on the right primary, that will help her. And Xavier Bertrand, are you just to kind of finish off on this section? Are you at all? What do you think his background? Because you did mention his, sort of a more provincial, right, type of candidate, which in France I think also can play to his advantage in a number of ways. I mean, this is a guy who was what, like an insurance executive. He was sort of like small town, sort of like insurance executive. So not necessarily someone the from the the sort of the politician pipeline, right? And But it is very interesting that, again, as you mentioned, these two candidates have left the party's mold. They've left kind of the party establishment. At this stage, it is really hard not to see in Les Républicains kind of an empty shell, and kind of just a dead structure already.
Yeah,
So
because they will end up supporting, if Bertrand or Pécresse run and are in a good position, Les Républicains will end up supporting them, despite the fact they left the party. I mean, it's very humiliating, but I think they will have to. There are other kind of in-house candidates as well, but I don't think they are as likely.
Yeah, and before we switch to maybe some of the other upsets or black swans that could eventually crop up elsewhere in the electoral realm, let's perhaps close off by stressing that one of the difficulties for the center right going into this race is that a lot of its elder, kind of like respectable, government experienced people got tapped. Quite simply, they got tapped by Macron, right? I mean, his first prime minister was a mayor of Le Havre, quite sizable city, Edouard Philippe, right? And a lot of the people who had initially been very active and vocal in the 2017 center-right primary, very soon as Pénélope Gay started kind of taking a toll on François Fillon's hopes to be the next president, very soon they started leaving, defecting. And perhaps that's also some of the bitter memories that the right is also, the center right is also having to grapple with. But let me ask you, because there is, as you've explained a couple of times on the show, there are so many unknown variables. There are just so many other black swans that we don't know, like where are they're going to be hitting us. And what are some of the other like big uncertainties of this race going into the primaries?
Well, first of all, there's the scenario on the right, which we touched on a lot. If you get a strong right wing candidate that takes a few points away from Macron, I think the runoff ticket will be around 20%, 25%. So if they manage to take a few votes away from Macron, who knows? That could work out. But I think we've got that already. The other kind of interesting scenario is on the left, and first of all, one thing which we have to say is the left is a lot weaker than it has been historically. It's not just in France; it's the case in most European countries. The left has been declining. Social democratic parties, in particular, have been declining in strength over the past years. And the Socialist Party, after François Hollande's disastrous 5 years, when he wasn't even in a position of running to defend his 5 years, are so weak nowadays. They are polling at 5%, 6%. I mean, for a party of this size, for a party of this history, it is pretty harsh. It's very harsh. So, who else is the landscape? You've got the Green Party, who have been rising the past few months, and you've got the far left with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the France Insoumise Party. These are the kind of three main actors, the kind of small actors here and there, but three main actors of the Socialists, the Greens, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, France Insoumise.
So let's begin right from the get go. I do think you hit a really important point in terms of the wider European context for why the Social Democrats have been plummeting. And I do think an important piece of context is just to mention also that François Hollande was in the, or at least in the initial days of his, the campaign trail ahead of 2012. He was categorized as being on the hard edged left of social democracy, kind of like the Belgian Social Democrats, right? I mean, Le Discours du Bourget, one of his core kind of campaign speeches was, essentially along the lines of "I will wage war against finance," right? At a time when France, right, was also kind of struggling with some of the fallout of '08. And let me ask you right from the start. This is really interesting. The makeup you've just outlined. What are the chances of a sort of popular front like ticket in the runoff? What are the chances that we end up whether yeah union? What are the chances that in front of either Macron or Le Pen in the second round, we find maybe I frankly don't expect anyone from the PS to rise up to this level. But what are the chances that Jean-Luc Mélenchon manages to federate both the kind of the center left and the old kind of les ténors de la gauche, the old kind of politicians who are kind of left without a home in this new landscape, and the hardcore left, and the hardcore left.
I sincerely doubt it because, first of all, the question of egos. Jean-Luc Mélenchon has bruised a few people in his political career, especially on the left.
Mm.
There's a lot of ego. A lot of people think Jean-Luc Mélenchon is too old and should move along. The socialists, are very humiliated and they don't want to. Mélenchon used to be part of the Socialist Party. He was a substitute essentially. He was on the bench. He wasn't that important. And one of the reasons he left is because he felt humiliated. And one of his one of the reasons he has been so powerful and so driven, one of the reasons that's been driving him for all that time, is the destruction of the socialists. So at least he achieved that. It's not very clear whether um, he's in a position to actually win himself, but at least he has destroyed the Socialist Party.
And
Um,
let's
so, yeah.
just remember. Can we just remind our audience that he was an education minister in the '80s, and the sort of the big tent really left to hardcore left government Mitterrand oversaw, and you're essentially you're saying that he is soured on the PS as a party, and that
So he got screwed every time. There's all these party congresses, and Hollande would cheat. And the way these things would work is you'd have all these different motions, and they were called A, B, C, D, and they had like impossible socialist names with like all the buzzwords you can think of, and whoever would have the largest share, or you had two or three motions uniting to get more than 50% of a share. And they cheated all the time. They added votes and one. So it was and every single time Mélenchon would get screwed. Like he would get like 6%, which wasn't true.
yeah.
And Hollande would find a way to screw him over. So
Mm.
yeah, he doesn't like Hollande. And so that's one of the reasons he has a lot of grudges against his old party, because he felt he was treated unfairly. He felt like he was representing something and he wasn't treated properly.
Yeah,
So
and let's remind folks as well that the ticket that Mélenchon will be running under is the unsubmissive France, right? The idea of like les insoumis, right, which is a big tent kind of coalition of really like really, I mean, the whole nine yards, right? You've got like Le Parti de Gauche, which is Mélenchon's native kind of little home. Um, but it really cuts across all of the French left, right, all the way up to like these sort of hardcore Maoist, trade unionist, like fractious little parties, right, like the likes of like Philippe Poutou, etc. But this is really a big tent, a kind of a popular front for the left. And I wanted to, before we kind of leave Jean-Luc Mélenchon, I did want to ask you, what do you think are the chances that he goes at least into the first round with a fair shot at representing, empowering the sort of the racial identitarian hardcore left that we've seen rear its ugly head over recent years in debates such as like obviously laïcité, but also all the crisis that French universities are going through? What are the chances that he kind of seizes that niche?
So his evolution on this topic, I find, is fascinating and a bit disheartening as well, because he was on the left of the left on these issues, which back then used to be very, very strict on the separation of church and state, very strong on laicite and whatnot. And over the past years, by a mix of, first of all, the demography of his own party, the kind of people who would staff his party would come from NGOs and all kind of leftist environment, which is much more multicultural, much more open to American ideas on race and whatnot. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is also a kind of political reality, which is you want seats, you want to become an MP. And more, if you look at where these MPs are, they are in the banlieue, they're in the Quartier Nord de Marseille, which are the equivalent of the banlieue in Marseille. And there's a reality, which is if you're going to come with your very strict laic message on separation of church and state and whatnot, it's not going to work as well. Because there's a lot of immigrants, a lot of people from Muslim backgrounds and whatnot. So that's first reality. And so as a result, second reality, and as a result, he's been changing a lot of these issues, and he went to this very controversial protest against Islamophobia last year, which was started by people who are kind of Muslim Brotherhood adjacent and whatnot, and so he lost a lot of credit here because the reason he was so strong in 2017 is because he managed to have this very broad tent of supporters from the left, but he shedded the word left from his dialogue, from his discourse back in 2017, because he had this kind of larger populist energy behind him. And I remember you even had like some right wing voters who were thinking about voting for him because he spoke well, because he all of a sudden he was okay with a flag, he was a bit strict on immigration and whatnot. And so he had this kind of very impressive populist energy, and he was so close. He lost by 600,000 votes. He didn't make it to the runoff by 600,000 votes, and that really destroyed his morale for the next 6 months or so. Nowadays, I don't think so. I think he has, over the past 2 years, made this evolution towards a kind of multicultural approach, and he has shedded the laicite, the strong on laicite aspect of his discourse a lot since 2017, and I don't think he's been able to have a broad tent on this, and especially because I think this is going to become an important issue in the years to come.
That's really interesting, and I think it really goes in the direction of kind of what we saw play out in 2017, where at one specific juncture in the campaign, as you're just explaining, we saw Mélenchon radically shift, or at least radically change the imagery around him, right? Like I do remember, like right around kind of the early spring, going into May already, or at least going into the first round in 2017, we saw Mélenchon, or at least it was picked up this way by mainstream media, kind of like shifted his campaign's imagery from like a hardcore new left, kind of like coalitional perspective with like a lot of like red flags at his campaign meetings, right, at his campaign rallies, right. All of a sudden, leading into the first round, we saw a lot more cocarde. We saw a lot more French imagery, Republican imagery, right? A lot of kind of national imagery, and I was also right around the time when Mélenchon relied on like holograms to broadcast his speeches right across several. Yeah, I think it was extraordinary because a lot of elder people, I think a lot of the elder kind of hardcore left had this sort of unthinking trust on Mélenchon, and the fact that he would lead the presidential, um, like the field, that he would lead the field in the implementation of these sort of like um, futuristic methods. I think that really played to his advantage, and uh, this is really interesting because he will remain just as he was, I think, in 2017, with these two radically different sides of his character. I think he will remain a wild card. I think that there's a lot of people who aren't really. I think we don't really know what to expect from the Muslims.
I agree with you, because there's one thing which we can't ignore, is that he's a really, really good campaigner. He's an incredible public speaker. He's probably the strongest public speaker in France as of now. He's kind of the last of his older generation, who are extremely talented, who have but just speak. When you speak, I'm not a fan of Mélenchon, whatever, but there is something going on. He has all his history, all these historical references all the time. It's incredibly powerful. So that's something you can't ignore. And every single time people underestimate him at the start of the presidential election, the same thing in 2012, 2017, and in the end he does really well. Unlike Le Pen, for example, who always starts her campaigns really, really well, but she's a pretty average campaigner and she isn't the best public speaker and whatnot. And so she ends up dropping towards the end. But Mélenchon is kind of the opposite. So I think he has lost a lot of credit over the past few years. Don't forget also there was his huge outburst when he was investigated over his party finances. He was investigated by the police at like 6 a.m. in his flat, and he exploded. He just got completely crazy. Started saying, "I am the Republic is me. Don't touch me." It was a bit ridiculous, but the images of that were really, really damning. Him insulting the cops doing their job and whatnot.
Well, whomever,
Um,
whomever in France is free of the sacralist vein of like, I am the Republic, cast the first stone, right? It's kind of
yeah, but he said it. He said it openly. Other people trying to hide it a bit, but anyways. But to go back to the question of the union of the left question, I don't think it's going to happen formally. I don't think it's possible. Maybe the Greens and the Socialists, but I don't think like a white ticket from Mélenchon to the Greens and the Socialists is possible. What I do think is possible is something along the lines of what we saw in 2017, which is you have kind of equally matched candidates, and one of them is starting to take over the rest, and there's a snowball effect, which is you get a lot of left-wing voters who vote tactically, and you think, what, I need my candidate to reach the runoff, and I'd rather have one left-wing candidate, even if it's not the candidate I prefer, than having to choose between Macron and Le Pen. And so what you saw in 2017 is the socialist candidate and Jean-Luc Mélenchon being kind of side by side for a long time. And at some point, Mélenchon did really well. His debate performance was incredible. And so there was a snowball effect with plenty of socialist voters leaving in droves to vote Mélenchon. And this is what we could see de facto is not a formal union of the left, but a de facto union of the left where one candidate all of a sudden starts taking over the others. And the voters saying, you know what, Mélenchon actually has a chance. Let's vote for him rather than vote for whatever candidate was going to do 4% or 6% or whatever. So this is something we might see. But a formal one is complicated.
Yeah, which is a good segue into like what the challenge is on these sort of fringy, if you look at both Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen as like the populist insurgents and kind of overlook the ideological difference across both. I mean, you did say, which I think is absolutely true, that both covet an electorate that is out there that is broadly overlaps with La France d'en bas, quite simply, right? The sort of like the people whom Michel Houellebecq depicts in his novels, right, and some of his latest work, right? The idea that we have a large like populace that is quite simply not served by the current political system and the policy outputs coming out of it, and I think both are coveting that electorate. And within that electorate, there's a lot of people. I think we tend to overestimate the extent to which the people in La France d'en bas are either like rabidly Le Penist or rabidly trade unionist / hardcore leftist. I do think that both are going to be raised, and you're seeing some of that play out already. I think that Le Pen is already expecting that some like a sizable portion of first round Mélenchon voters will eventually come around to voting for her in the runoff. I think that's like already kind of in the mindset of both candidates. And I guess you may want to kind of turn over, and we'll cut this off. I'm losing my train of thought, but I guess you may want to transition towards what are some of the other black swans that we haven't discussed yet? Like, what's this whole deal with Éric Zemmour, for instance?
Yeah. So I think what Macron did in 2017, which was extraordinary, is he managed to unite I'm not going to talk about the elites because I think it's too reductionist, but a kind of elitist bloc who were separated between left-wing parties and right-wing parties, but in the end ended up agreeing on a lot of things and were increasingly frustrated that they had to stay in parties which were pandering to their right or pandering to their left. And so all of a sudden you've got Macron, and Macron says, you know what, you guys on the left and you guys on the right were actually a lot closer than you think. let's create one big party and we'll represent your interests and your ideals a lot better. And this is how you've kind of pure pro-European party, kind of fiscally a conservative party, a socially liberal party, in many ways represented the elitist bloc on the right and the left and united them. But on the flip side, there hasn't been this kind of unifying of a populist bloc. This populist bloc has been divided to some extent on the far left, but mostly on the far right, and among people who don't vote, the abstentionists. What we saw in 2019 with in 2018 with the Gilets jaunes, I think is the closest thing we saw to the unification of this populist bloc. There is people who aren't that political, who all of a sudden feel like they've been, because back then Macron, had all these very arrogant comments off the cuff, which were really provocative and whatnot. And there was this increasing feeling that there was this out of touch elitist government being very arrogant with, the les gens d'en bas, with the common people. And so they not only revolted against Macron, but they created a sense of common strength, a strength of a feeling of common identity, because they didn't realize they were this powerful. They got Macron to spend 25 billion, or now it seems like nothing, but back then 25 billion euros seemed like a lot of money. Nowadays we're throwing billions every day, but back then 25 billions was a huge change, a huge shift in Macron, which was running much more supply side economics, and they realized their strength. And I think this kind of feeling of common strength, this kind of populist bloc, is something which someone will want to harness at some point. Le Pen has a part of that bloc, but she's Le Pen, so her name is a bit divisive and whatnot, and so she can't reach that bloc entirely. But you could have it doesn't have to be a politician. Look what happened in Ukraine. It was a comedian. Look what happened in Italy. It was Beppe Grillo, another comedian. It could be a singer. It could be, like Patrick Sébastien, for those who know him as a pretty funny musician or comedian. I think we could see that. It could be an army man like Général de Villiers, who used to be Macron's top general, who has kind of floated. He might run, maybe not, probably not. And the other wild card, which I think is the more likely of the scenarios, is Éric Zemmour. Éric Zemmour, for people who don't know him, is a bit like, think Tucker Carlson in France. He's been on TV for the past 15 years. He wrote a few books which sold really, really well on French history, on French politics and whatnot. He's very much on the right. He is Eurosceptic, anti-immigration, very, very tough on Islam, but also, kind of traditionally Gaullist in the sense that he thinks the state should intervene a lot in the economy, and very, very critical of globalization and whatnot. And so he's become very popular over the past few years on the kind of fringe right between the Les Républicains and Rassemblement National. And he doesn't like Le Pen. He thinks she's incompetent. He thinks she's not up to it and whatnot. And so he's thinking about running. And that could change a few things. First of all, very cynically, could weaken Le Pen. So maybe Macron would like Zemmour to run and weaken Le Pen. But thing is, I don't think Zemmour, as much of a wild card he could be, I don't think he has potential to unify that populist bloc, because I think he is too identified on the right, too identified with politics to do that. I think it would have to be someone like Zelensky in Ukraine, or Beppe Grillo, someone who has kind of a wider non-political appeal. And also, I think if you look at Zemmour, there's a physical attraction you need to create when you're presidential candidate. You need to. There's a reason why Hollande did a diet before running in 2012. People need to physically love their president to some extent. And you look at Zemmour, he's kind of intellectually charismatic, but he's not physically charismatic in any of those ways. I think we're not. We could very well see a populist upset, which with someone we haven't even talked about in this podcast so far. So I think that's something we need to keep an eye on.
Which makes the race just so riveting and truly like gripping, right? Like this really is shaping up to be one of the most uncertain races of Fifth Republic history, right? And as uncertain and as upsetting the 2017 race already was in a lot of ways. And I mean, look, nobody expected what the outcome of 2017 would be. a short few months in advance. But at this point already in the run up to the race, we are, I think, pretty clueless as to or at least how. I mean, the polling for the first round is also historically unstable. Like at this point, comparatively. Um, I think if you compare to historical standard. Now, I thought some of the things you explained about Zemmour were so interesting. I mean, here's like someone who, like, I think early on in his youth, wanted to be part of la technosphère, right? Wanted to be the technocratic right center right leader as part of the Gaullist legacy. I think failed his INA examination, right? He kind of twice, right? And then he's had this very brilliant. I mean, he did come from Sciences Po earlier, so he's kind of like networked into some of these circles. But he did have just an outstanding intellectual career. I would say popular intellectual career more so than actual like academic intellectual. But some of his books, again, like they've been, as you said, they've been read almost universally across some of these like France d'en bas swaths of the territory where these people are looking for answers and they're looking for a candidate, and they've read Zemmour, and I think they can, as you said, they can relate to him on a number of levels. Not so much again on his charisma, but I do think that if we're looking for a candidate who can provide yet another upset and kind of gather up and round up some of the populist anger that is brewing on both the right and the left, and maybe unify that and make it cohesive and coherent and able to genuinely have a say in this race. I think we should be thinking of Zemmour pretty prominently.
I will push back a little bit on that, because he is widely read, but widely read nowadays is not the same thing as widely read 50 years ago. And he is, so there was a few polls that tried him out. He's at 13%, which isn't bad on your name only, but isn't a huge hit either. So I think if you really want someone to unify this kind of amorphous populist bloc, which we saw with Gilets jaunes, it would have to be someone who is much less identified with politics, a comedian, something like that. So, just a few points before we go. Some of the issues I think we need to talk. First of all, Michel Barnier is not going to run. I'm not sure who in Brussels floated that idea. It's stupid. He's a strong politician. He has had an incredible career and whatnot. But first of all, he doesn't have this kind of charisma I was talking about. Jacques Chirac called him the ski instructor back in the days. So he's not going to be running something. The Greens, there's a huge energy around the Greens over the past few months. They did a very strong performance at the European election. They did good performance at the latest municipal elections. But first of all, the Greens always do pretty well at the European elections. And they just crash and burn every time of presidential election. I mean, it is every single time. So a word of warning about that. The Greens are strong on local issues, strong kind of international issues. On the one side, they'll talk about your pollution, your issues with cars in cities, kind of very local issues. The other side, they'll talk about huge global warming issues and international agreements and whatnot. And the kind of national sphere is one which they kind of struggle to do, because the German Greens could be the French Greens, could be the British Greens. There's no strong national identification.
Yeah.
In an election which is so national, I think they're not going to do well.
Yeah, and it is going to be a national race. Yeah.
It is going to be a national race. So yeah, because especially because I think some of the main issues which will dominate 2022 will be the issue of which we've covered with Gilles Kepel, the issue of Islamist separatism, and I think on these issues are extremely weak. And the other one in which I think will be a strong one will be kind of economic patriotism post-COVID and whatnot. And I think on the left, they are not the strongest on this issue. I could see a more traditional left-wing candidate like maybe Arnaud Montebourg or someone like that become candidate. But I really don't see the Greens doing well in 2022.
Yeah. which which is a good way to wrap things up. This will be majorly a national race. I think some of the anger that is already building up in terms of the widening gulf that a lot of popular background kind of French, like average Joe background, like small town, like not really into politics all that much, but if to the extent they're into politics in a very angry way. I think that a lot of the people that all these varying parties are vying for are going to be, I think, are going to be a lot angrier by the time we reconvene to discuss the first round than they're already now. I think the anger is building. I think a lot of it is just COVID quantum. How, sure. The government as every government is, the government is trying to alleviate and to relieve some of the financial pressures at the kitchen table through varied channels. But what can't really be what cannot really be solved is the sense that there was already a very big and wide disconnect between the political class and the rest of the country, and that COVID is furthering those gulfs, right? That the French political class are weathering COVID smoothly and just fine. They're doing fine. They're not having. They have these pensions and they have these, personal chauffeurs, and they're not having to, they're not having to like be inventive to boucler la fin de mois, right? They have their financial prosperity is assured. And I do think that's going to play out massively, and the anger is going to be building. But I'm so glad we got into a lot of the things that we can already glean from in terms of who are the candidates going to be, what are the procedural things to know, and what are the black swans that people can expect to crop up. So I'm so glad we did this, and thank you so much for walking us through all of that, Francois. And we hope to catch our audience in a future episode. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.